Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on the EEO-1 webinar this morning. I'm very lucky to be joined by Nicole here, who leads our HR and benefit products, and she'll be talking about the iSolved applications that can make this really, really simple for you. As always, I like to take questions as we go along. So if you put your questions in the chat, I will get to all of them and answer them as best I can. So let's dive into this. This is actually one of the more straightforward webinars we've done. If you joined us last week for the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, that was a new regulations, very complex. This has been around for a while. There's some minor changes this year, but it should be pretty straightforward for everybody. Let me get rid of this little. There we go. So this is sort of the agenda for today, so that we record all of these and we provide the slide decks to everybody. And by the way, I'm Ann Lavelle. I'm the compliance specialist. If you haven't seen me before, I practiced law for 20 some years, did a management side, labor and employment, and retired. But I always enjoyed the educational component. So I love doing the seminars. I love answering questions. This is our agenda for today. So if you want to go back and check where something is, you can sort of find it easily by knowing the order of things that were presented today. Before we dive into the EEO-1, so we are doing a full webinar on this next week on Thursday, May 9th at 11 o'clock, and I invite you to join. If you have any questions about these two topics, we're going to do a deep dive next week. But feel free to ask in the chat this morning, too, if you need something answered. We'll try to answer it this morning. I will save those questions, though, to the end to be respectful of everybody's time who logged on here today for the EEO-1 content. But if you have questions about these two new legislative updates, please feel free to ask. We'll cover it at the end. But I just want to make sure everybody is aware that we have a May 9th webinar on these two topics. And just as a 30,000-foot overview of this, the one that's most critical to employers is that the FLSA salary basis or salary test was increased or will be increased starting in July of this year. And then we'll go further January 1st. You can see the jumps. In order to be exempt and not have to pay somebody overtime for work in excess of 40 hours, or in some states, there's other overtime rules, but in Pennsylvania, it's over 40 hours. The employee must meet what's known as the duties test. And we have a number of webinars discussing the duties test for the primary exemptions. Let me see, I have a Q&A here. Okay, somebody just asked, will the slide deck be made available after the presentation? Yes, as I try to move this over. Yes, the slide deck is made available. Just give us some time to get it out. The lady who works that magic is not me. I'm not allowed to touch most technical stuff here. At CTR, I have a tendency to break stuff. But in any event, the lady who does it is actually out ill today. So give us a little bit of time, but the recording and the slide deck is made available to everybody, and you get an email with the slide deck and the link to the presentation and anything else you might want. The same is true for the May 9th or the previous webinars. If you say, gosh, I'd love to attend the May 9th, we just can't get enough of the FLSA, but I'm not available at 11 o'clock, sign up for it. You will get the link. You can watch it at your leisure. You'll get the slide deck, all that good stuff. But in any event, to be eligible for the to not pay overtime to an employee, they must meet the duties test, which again, we've done a number of webinars on that. And they must earn a certain amount day in, day out, every week. And you can see those amounts on your screen. They have gone up considerably. And they're supposed to increase every 3 years. So just be aware that that is out there. There are legal contests in the courts with respect to this, but you need to sort of think about that. The Federal Trade Commission also got in on the act a week ago, just to make everybody's life interesting, and banned almost all non-competes. Again, we'll talk about these two topics in depth a week from today, but I want to make sure that you're aware of this. And somebody did ask a question here. Did we expect the FLSA to be challenged? It is already challenged. There are a couple court cases moving forward. They'll probably be consolidated. Do I think it'll be delayed? Yes, I think it'll be delayed. Do I ultimately think it'll be overturned? That's a close call. I would prepare as if this is going into effect. Probably not on the dates listed there, but it will probably go into effect. So again, any other FLSA or FTC questions I'll take at the end of the seminar. And we will right now dive into what everybody's here for, which is the EEO-1. Why now? Why are we having a webinar today? Why do we care? Well, the portal for the EEOC, their online filing system, the OFS, opened April 30th. So it opened 2 days ago. It runs until June 4th. And there's actually, if you fail by June 4th, you'll get a nasty gram from them saying, hey, do it immediately. There's a little bit more time. But you really don't want to get that nasty gram. Getting nasty grams from government agencies really should not be a goal of any employer. So don't wait. Do it now. Get it off your to-do list. And the reason I say do it now is especially if you're larger, you will come across some sort of error, something that you say, gosh, I'm not sure I have the right information for this. We have missing information. The head count is off somehow. You need to give yourself time to look into it. But that portal is open right now for you to register if you're not already registered and put your data into it. And Nicole's going to talk about how easy that can be with iSolve, but I'm going to sort of talk about the nuts and bolts of what is this report and what are you looking to provide. This is my final slide information, but I'm going to talk about it right now anyway. For private employers, there's no penalty if you mess this up or if you don't do it. I'm not advising that you shouldn't do it, but I am saying put it in perspective. This is a good faith effort. If at the end of the day, you're stuck on one employee and you can't figure out what race they are, it's not the end of the world. So put it in perspective. It's something you need to do, but there's not like some huge monetary penalty if you get something wrong with it. All right. Who are the mandatory filers? If you're on this call, you probably believe you're a mandatory filer, but just to make sure everybody is on the same page, you must file. And again, there's no penalty if you don't for a private employer. If you have more than 100 employees. For purposes of the 100, we count all commonly owned or commonly controlled enterprises together. So that's an important concept. Later in this discussion, we'll talk about what's known as different establishments, different locations. But for knowing whether or not you're a mandatory filer, we're looking at common control, common ownership. That is, in the EEOC's world, a very broad net. So those of you who are familiar with like the Affordable Care Act or other laws that require you to determine common ownership, the EEOC net of who they catch, so to speak, with requiring them to file, they're just looking for common control, which is a broader standard. So just be aware that if you have any questions as to whether or not you've got 100, you're looking at the entire organization that's under common ownership or common control. So if I own part and Nicole owns part, and then Nicole owns part of another company and I own part of another company, we would want to look at that and say, is that one enterprise for purposes of counting employers or employees, even though I'm only a partial owner of one and Nicole's a partial owner of another and whatever. The EEOC again takes a very broad view of what's an entire enterprise. Federal contractors, if you're a federal contractor, this is one of the easiest things you have to do. We are not getting into OFCCP compliance today, but this is a part of it. So if you're a federal contractor and you want to keep getting federal contracts, which is usually the goal, you must file this if you have more than $50,000 in contracts, subcontracts, or purchase orders, and more than 50. So it's a 50-50 type of rule. 50,000, 50 employees. You need to file the EEO-1. All right, so just an example, we kind of covered this, but just so you have an example out there. If you had a headquarters, a parent corporation with 30 employees, and you own two separate subsidiaries, they're legally separate, they're separate companies, and they each have 35 employees in them. Are you a single enterprise for purposes of the EEO-1? And the answer is yes, you are a single enterprise. Somebody asked a question, do K-12 charter schools need to file? So any private employer needs to file this if they have more than 100 employees, or if they are a government contractor and have more than 50 or more than 50,000 in contracts. Okay, somebody asked, once you file, do you always have to file if you drop below 100 employees? So the answer is no. The EUC recognizes that there is variation. If you're right on that cusp, this year you have 101 employees and next year you might have 98. We'll talk about when we measure that a little bit later, but the answer to your question just generally is no. If this year you have over 100 and something terrible happens and you have a layoff and you lose half your workforce next year, no, you don't have to file. So once a filer is not always a filer. It usually is just because businesses, you hope, tend to grow and succeed and employ more employees. But if you have variation like that, no, once a filer, it doesn't mean you always file. So great question. All right, what data are we looking at? So this gets into when we look at whether we have 100 employees or not. To some extent, this is the employer's choice. So you can select any pay period that you want. It's your choice. In the fourth quarter, between October 1st and December 31st for the reporting year, which is 2023. It's the workforce snapshot is what they call it. So if at any point during that last quarter, you had more than 100 employees, even if you might have a total 50% layoff in December, if you had 100 employees in October and November, you have to file. So going to the one individual who asked about, do you always have to file? No, but if you have 100 employees during any payroll period in that last quarter, you must file. It's required. So you get to pick the snapshot. There's really usually not a lot of magic to it because people's payrolls don't tend to change that much, or the demographics of who are in it don't tend to change that much. But if you feel like a certain payroll period is most representative of your workforce, by all means, pick that one. All right. So one of the key points here, though, is whatever payroll you pick, you can have people starting and stopping in terms of employment mid-payroll cycle, right? Maybe Anne only worked a week in the payroll period that you picked because Anne decided not to show up for work because she had better things to do with her life, she decided, and you terminated me. If I was employed for any day, if I was an employee at any point during that payroll period that you picked, you have to include me, even if I was terminated midway through that payroll period. Okay. The most complex part about the EEO-1 forms is knowing and making sure you're filing either as a single establishment or a multi-establishment employer. So this really seems somewhat straightforward, but you can get complexities out of this. If you just have one business location, I have one store in downtown Pittsburgh, then I am a single establishment employer. But if I have a store in Pittsburgh and one in Erie and one in Harrisburg and one in Cleveland, I am a multi-establishment employer. And that is a critical distinction for the forms because a single establishment employer has the benefit of just having one essentially EEO-1 form to file, and a multi-establishment employer gets the pleasure of filing 3. And we'll talk about, there are actually more than 3, but 3 types of forms. All right, so you count all physical locations within the US. You don't count your international locations. If anybody here has a location somewhere outside the US, we're not counting that. Conversely, if you are a foreign-owned company, and I know when I practiced, we had a lot of clients that the headquarters was over, say, in Germany, but they had multiple locations here in the States. It does not matter that it's an internationally owned company. They still have to file for their locations here in the US. You also have to decide which of your locations is your headquarters. And oftentimes that's a really easy call. But sometimes when the headquarters is actually in Germany, it's not so easy as to say which of our locations here is going to be the headquarters. But you do need to pick one and file. Okay, again, single establishment employers, pretty straightforward. You're going to submit a single establishment employer report. And basically, you're counting up your employees and you're categorizing them by job category. We'll talk about that more in a little bit here. Sex, we'll talk about that a little bit more later because that's not as clear cut as it used to be. And race or ethnicity. And that's how you're saying. So you would say, hey, Anne, right? Female, white, probably falls into the professional employee category. And you would go from there. And we'll talk about how do you determine it if it's not clear cut as to whether Anne is white or not, or female, or whatever it might be. For a multi-establishment employer, you're tracking the same data, but you're ending up with 3 different types of reports. One of the critical things here is to make sure your numbers add up. Math is not my strong point, so I'm definitely not being critical. And Nicole will talk about iSolved can help you match up your numbers so that hopefully you get totals that make sense. That's sort of like one of your biggest jobs here, is to make sure that if you have a headquarters report, and maybe you have 35 people at your headquarters, and you have 2 establishments, right? You have a location in Cleveland and one in Philly, and your headquarters is Pittsburgh, and you have 30 in each of those locations, that when you total all this up, or you have 35 in each of those locations, the grand total is like 100 employees or 105, whatever the math is. That the math is math, and as I think they say these days, you want to make sure that it makes sense. So the headquarters report is your headquarters, whatever your headquarters is. The establishment is each of your separate locations. That's not your headquarters. For those of you who have been around the block, and God bless you, and you're still doing HR, you may remember a day or a time when you had to do different types of reports, type 4, type 8, for different establishments. That has gone out the window. That's a relief, I think, to most employers. You are not looking at what type of establishment you have anymore. You're just saying it is an establishment that's not our headquarters. So that should be good news for employers. Then once you enter the headquarter numbers into the EEOC OFS, that's our online filing system, and you enter the establishment numbers, it generates for you. So this is pretty easy. The EEOC is actually kind of doing the math for you here. What's called a consolidated report. And that adds up everybody in the headquarters plus each of the establishment and says, this is your grand totals. Now, although the EEOC computer system is doing that for you, the EEOC expressly says it's your responsibility to make sure our computer system did it correctly at the EEOC. And so what you're looking for is, do the totals make sense, right? The consolidated report should have a head count that is the equivalent of everybody in the headquarters report and everybody in the establishment reports. No employee should be counted more than once. And what's on the 2 reports or 3 reports should all make sense. It should all gel together. I think I have a couple more questions. Let me go over here real quick and look. Okay. All right, I have a working at home question. I will get to that. That's in one of my slides in a second. So the question, just so that everybody knows what it is, because we'll talk about it, it's a great question. And it's certainly a very timely question post-COVID because there's a lot of remote workers. The question is, what if you have multiple locations in multiple states, but your employees are working remotely at home in many additional states? How do you handle establishments? So that is a fantastic question. Give me a moment and we will get to that in another screen. Okay. All right, here we are, remote workers. So one of the key concepts from the EEOC is that you have to include the remote workers. That's not a surprise, right? They're one of our employees. You have to figure out what establishment you think they report to, even if they're working out of their home most of the time. And remember, there's no penalty if you mess this up. It's a good faith effort. And so there probably is a way that you can rationally determine this. Maybe you say, well, gosh, Ann works at home most of the time, but she's in Pittsburgh and our closest office to her is Philadelphia. And so therefore, her establishment is Philadelphia, even though she's over in Pittsburgh, because that's the closest one. Or her boss is out of Philadelphia. That's who she reports to. You want to use some logic that makes sense to sort of assign each of these remote workers to one of your establishments. The worst thing you can do, and the EEOC has this like in bold print all over their instruction booklet that's online about EEO-1 filings, they do not want the employee's home address to be an establishment. My home is in no way, shape, or form one of your establishments or one of an employer's establishments. So that is a really critical thing. The EEOC is not going to be particularly thrilled if they get a list of establishments that's one person at their home address. So whatever logical system you use to assign employees who are remote workers to a location, to an establishment, maybe we all report to your headquarters. Maybe that's where all our bosses are. Maybe it's the establishment that's geographically closest. Whatever it might be, you will sort of assign me to an establishment or headquarters, and that is where you will list the remote workers. Client sites. So client sites in this context means companies that send employers out, oftentimes for long-term gigs, but not always, to a client site. So maybe I'm a IT employee and you're an IT company and you say, okay, company XYZ needs an IT person for the next 3 months at their location because they're doing whatever and they need a lot of help. So we're going to send Ann out there. Now, trust me, I'm not an IT person. We'd never send me anywhere. But we send somebody out there. They're at a client site. The client site, you could use the client site if you want as the address, or you can pick an establishment that makes sense. Again, just like we're from remote workers, maybe most of the time I report to my boss in the Pittsburgh office. So that's my sort of location or establishment. But you could pick the client site if you wanted to. The one thing I want to note with this is that while you have a choice right now as to whether you pick the client site as the establishment or one of your own establishments or headquarters, this is slated to change for 2025. They are looking at this and saying, I'm not so sure that a client site is the right spot. Maybe we want people to assign to an establishment with the original employer. Just be aware that this is in play right at the moment. So you have a choice now, but you likely won't have a choice by 2025 as to how you handle this. So you may want to think about just assigning them to an establishment or headquarters now. Okay, just checking that we don't have more questions. And I do appreciate that question, especially on remote workers. That's a great issue right now. Okay, job categories and classifications. So I have provided, and hopefully the link works, but if not, you can just type it in. There are 10 job categories, and I have listed them. You can see them there: executive, senior level officials and managers, first level professionals, technicians, sales workers, et cetera, et cetera. It's not always clear where somebody belongs. And so the EEOC has put together a 32-page guide. And in it, when you look at it, it has job category, executive, senior level. And then beside it, it has what they view as the likely potential job titles or job positions that somebody might hold, job subcategories or classifications is what we would call those, that would make up that overall category. And so if you have a question, and this really isn't that difficult, it just takes sort of leafing through this on-site booklet or website booklet a little bit. You can look up and say, gosh, does the EEOC already assign that particular job title or that particular classification to a category? And that's really, if they have done it, you don't want to get this wrong, because then it looks like you didn't even bother to look at their booklet. So if the job title is secretary and it has me assigned as an administrative support worker in their booklet, you don't want to like assign me to a service worker category, right? Because then that looks like we didn't even look at the resources the EEOC gave us to determine what that job category should be for Ann. Obviously, even with 32 pages of classifications, it doesn't cover everybody. So to the extent it doesn't, you need to make a good faith effort, a good faith judgment call as to what category that employee should be in. The one caution that the EEOC throws out there for everybody is they take a very dim view of who should be in the executive or senior level job category. And they essentially say that should only be your highest level employees, like your C-suite, right? Your CEO, your CFO, your CPO, CIO, whatever. In really large companies, they say, okay, that can go down maybe 2 levels of management, but that should not be your entire workforce as in your executive and senior level employees. We're looking for people that are typically in the C-suite, who are making policy decisions, and who are your top paid folks as well. So just being like a first level supervisor, that's not an executive position or a senior employee, even if they've been there for 30 years. Okay, let me make sure I don't have questions. All right, voluntary reporting here. So we're looking at reporting by race or ethnicity. That's one of the categories that we need to check off. And so what is a typical and common practice, and the EEOC has gifted you with language for this, and if the EEOC gives you a gift, don't turn it down. Often happens is when somebody is hired, you provide this language to them in some of the new hire paperwork, and OFCCP compliance folks, your federal contractor folks, you're tracking applicants too, so it's a little different for you. But for private employers, you're trying to figure out what race or ethnicity the person is. And the preferred way to do this is to ask the voluntary question, and you can see the sample language at the bottom of the slide there, so that I self-report. And typically is whatever I say, even if you think, well, gosh, Ann doesn't really look Hispanic to me, but she thinks she is, we're going to report it unless it's so blatantly wrong that we need to make a notation about it. If I refuse, if I sit there and say, well, forget that, I'm not telling my employer nothing, that's my right as an employee not to respond to this question, and you can't force me to respond. It's just an opportunity to do so. So hopefully the person responds and we use their information, and if there's anything really strange about what they put down, we will note it in the comment section on the EEO-1 form. But this is the preferred method. This is what the EEOC wants to see. And by the way, any information like this is kept separate and apart from the personnel file. It's considered confidential, so just be aware of that. Let's say Ann refuses. I say, forget it. I'm not telling you what race or ethnicity or gender I am. Drop dead. That's my choice. At that point, the backup system for this, for employers to be able to file the EEO-1 form, is observer identification. And that literally means that someone in your organization, which is usually the person who's lucky enough to wear that HR hat, is looking at Ann and saying, gosh, she looks female to me, and I think she looks white. And so that's what I'm going to mark down. Again, we're not going to keep it in the employment records. We're not going to keep it in Ann's personnel file that, Jim in HR thought she looked like a white female. but we are going to keep that record somewhere confidential, that was our observer identification because Anne refused to answer the voluntary questionnaire about this. Okay. Whoops, I think I went too far. All right, what are the definitions of race or ethnicity? These are kind of self-explanatory. Let me just mention on observer identification, it's not always straightforward, right? And we even have as one of the definitions here, 2 or more races. That is an option that you can pick. And if you're wrong and the person has not self-identified, you're making a good faith effort. It's your best guess. Sometimes it's really obvious. Sometimes it's not. And if the person hasn't responded, you can't like pester them for the information. So you do your best, right? And you can see the definitions there. And really, there's 5 ethnicities or races, basically, that they look at. The one thing I want to point out is when you are picking the 2 or more races that people can identify as, it doesn't work for somebody who's Hispanic and one of the other races or ethnicities. That's the EEOC rule. That's their opinion. Doesn't matter whether we agree with it or don't agree with it. That's their rules. And so that's the one little caveat on the identifying as 2 or more races that we need to be aware of. Okay. Reporting by sex. So life is not as straightforward as it maybe was 30 years ago. Right now, the EEO-1 form has not kept up with the times, so to speak. Right now, it's just a male or female option. That probably still works for most employees. And for most observer identifications, you can probably pretty easily tell. But we all know that that's not everybody identifies as just male or female anymore. There's lots and lots of different categories. And so you can get somebody who says they're non-binary or trans or whatever it is. You do not have to do this, but it is coming down the pike as a requirement in the future that you can say, okay, Anne just said she was non-binary. So what I can do is not check off the male or female box, but I can use the comment section in the form to explain that this employee who is white, biological female, identifies as something else, whatever it may be, and put that in the comments section. So the EEOC is inviting you to do that because their form right now just has 2 categories. And if we don't want to categorize somebody, we can make that as an option. If you don't want to do that and somebody has identified as non-binary, you could pick, oh gosh, I think they're a biological female or male, whatever, and check that box off. Maybe still put in the comment section that the person identified as non-binary or whatever they identified as. But we mark them because there's only 2 options. We mark them as their biological gender. This comment section, by the way, can be used for any issue in the form. It doesn't just have to be for the reporting by sex issues, right? Anything that you say, gosh, I'm not 100% sure how to report this, or I made a good faith judgment call that I'm a little concerned about. Again, there's no penalties for private employers with this, but this is your opportunity to be transparent to the EEOC and say, hey, we ran up against this issue when we were filling out this form. Again, doesn't have to just be about reporting by sex. It could be anything. And, maybe it was somebody who said, Anne said she's Black. And we don't know why she said that because we're concerned about whether or not she was being forthright on the self-identification form. Any issue you run up against like that is something that you can put in the comment section. So at least you're on record as saying, hey, we made a good faith attempt. Here was our issue. Here was our resolution of it. We're just telling you, EEOC. And the EEOC, they're not doing a deep dive into these usually. You don't have to fear too much what you put in there as long as you're not putting something completely inflammatory in the comment section. All right. Once you have all that, let me just take a quick drink here. Once you have all that, somebody has to certify this and be the point of contact. So the point of contact usually is never contacted. But the person certifying this is saying essentially, I am telling you, the government, the truth, and I acknowledge that if I have materially lied in this form, that I could be in a lot of hot water in terms of, it's basically like perjury, right? And so you oftentimes HR people certify this form. You just have to feel good about that. You've done a good faith effort and you've collected the data. You haven't just randomly made it up, and that to the best of your abilities and best of your knowledge, this is true. If you have any qualms about that, then you shouldn't be certifying the form. All right. Here to files. What happens if you blow the deadline? So the deadline's June 4th, right? If you fail to file, you get the nasty gram from the EEOC. And they're really looking at prior filers. And it may be a situation where you had 100 employees last year and now, business was bad. You only have 50. That's okay. If you get a nasty gram that says, hey, you filed last year and you didn't file this year, you just write a letter back saying, we didn't qualify this year. But if you're getting the nasty gram because you forgot or blew it off or whatever, for whatever reason you didn't file, they actually give you a small extension until July 9th to file. You really don't want to be a late filer because that just raises little red flags with the EEOC if you get a problem with them in terms of like a discrimination charge or something else where this form might be relevant. So you need to file timely, hopefully. If not, you get the nasty gram and you have a little extension of time to file. If you refuse, what can the EEOC do? Because we already said in my next slide is there's no penalties. Well, the EEOC, if they're really interested in it for whatever reason, can file a motion with a federal court to force you to file. And if you don't, then you're held in contempt of court. I have never, ever seen that done, but it is a possibility out there. I tend to think that would only be used for an employer that has a lot of red flags against it in the first place, but just know that it is a possibility. Don't ignore. Remember that this can be part of a document request or just part of documents that are associated with a discrimination case in the future. So that is a good reason to file it. If you're in the middle of a discrimination case, a charge of discrimination with the EEOC, you don't want the investigator going, look, I looked for your EEO-1 and I didn't see it. That's not really where you want to be with the investigator. Federal contractors, again, this is not an OFCCP compliance seminar because that would take us like 3 days to get through. And I don't think anybody wants to spend that much time with me. But the reason you file is, one, you're required to, but you can lose federal contracts if you fail to file. This is part of your OFCCP compliance. So private employers, there's not a whole lot of teeth in this rule for you, but you should still do it because you want to make yourselves look good. And it's a fairly easy, fairly straightforward thing to do. Federal contractors, assuming you want more federal contracts, you don't want to blow this off. Okay, let me make sure I don't have any questions. I don't see any more. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, who can tell you how to make this even easier for your life.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Thank you very much. So some of the things I want to cover, if you are currently a CTR client using iSolved or thinking about becoming a CTR client, the system does have the capability to run the report in the exact format that you will need to just take it and upload it into the EEOC filing site. So it makes it really easy for you. We also have a guide that we put together, so you will get that as part of this presentation as well. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. I don't want to take up too much time, leave some time for anyone who wants to ask questions. Just know that you will get that guide, and you also have your dedicated HR benefits rep that you can reach out to if you have questions. You can go to the next slide. Am I able to control that? Let me see. And can you click to the next slide? I don't know if I have that capability.
I'm sorry to jump in. Nicole, if you're saying or need me to advance the slide deck, I can't actually hear anything.
Okay. You
So
can't
just
hear
like raise
me?
your hand and wave at me if you need me to advance the slides.
Oh, I gotcha. Thank you. Okay, so how would we prepare to have all of that information in the system and ready for that report? There's a couple different things. So like I said, if you're currently a client, you're using iSolved, if you have onboarding, you can have that added as part of the process when that new hire is going through their onboarding. So they would complete this information during the process. It would be stored in iSolved so that when you do go to run that report, that data will be there for you. It's also available in self-service. So the employees can themselves go into the federal reporting section and answer those questions if they haven't done it during onboarding or you don't use the onboarding. You also would have the capability to do policy acknowledgements within the employee messages. So you're able to post the policies and information out there, and we're always available to help with that. So what's really important before you go out and run these reports is to check your data. We want to make sure that you have all the information in the system and updated, accurate. So that report is going to, be ready for you. You're going to run it. You're going to be able to go to that EEOC filing site, submit it, and not run into a bunch of issues. So really the areas that you're going to want to check in the system is the job section. And Anne kind of covered, she attached the link to go out and see what those different categories are. So you'll want to make sure that that information is updated. We touched on the ethnicity and gender piece, and she went over the establishments. All of that information is in iSolved. You want to make sure that it's all accurate and added. So establishments, and covered whether you're a single establishment, a multi-establishment, you want to go out into the establishments in iSolved, check your information, make sure it's out there. That ID number, you should have that in the letter that you receive about filing your EEO-1. So check that letter, you should have that ID there. And then you'll want to check the jobs. So you see with that red square around it, the regulatory options, the EEO category. So that is where you're going to add that information that Anne touched on. And, like I mentioned, she has the link to the guide, so you can use that to determine what's going to apply for those particular jobs. Just make sure you have that all set up. And then your federal reporting data. So under the federal reporting data, you'll see there's the 3 tabs. If you're collecting that information during onboarding, most of it's going to be there. As Anne mentioned, your employees can opt not to provide it. So you may have some that are blank. And in that case, like Anne had mentioned, you'll just want to go into the report once you've run it and add that information in and add the comments. And then these are the reports that you're going to be using. They're already formatted for you. You don't need to do any formatting in terms of how they're set up. You're just going to use these then to, if you need to add comments, add that additional information, you'll be able to do that. But aside from that, they're ready for you to use. One thing to keep in mind is your dates. You want to make sure that you're using the correct period end dates for your pay periods, or you're going to get a blank report. So if you run the report, it comes back blank, double check your dates. As was mentioned, you want it to be in that 4th quarter of the year that you're doing the reporting, and choose one of those pay periods, and then it should bring back that data. once you run the report. So you'll see the report and the export. You want to run the report, and then any of the data is going to pull into there. So you'll be able to see any of those exceptions in the exception portions of the report. So if they're missing like one piece of it, you'll see them there. If someone is missing everything, then you're not going to see them on the report. So just double check that information. This is just kind of some, steps for it. So you can look at that when it's ready to run. When you go out to the portal, you're able to enter the information manually. You'd still want to run that report so that you can use that to enter the information, or you can do the import. So that just kind of lets you know the steps that you would want to take. Like we talked about, you'll want to make sure you're choosing that valid period end date from your payroll run. Otherwise, your report's not going to bring back that data. And
Okay.
just to cover any issues, any questions, you can reach out
Okay,
to your
great.
support rep.
My internet connection is also saying it's unstable, even though I'm in the office. This is why I'm not allowed to have nice things. Not sure where all the technical issues went. Nicole, I'm sorry, I could not hear a word of anything you said. That's why I muted myself for a second, because I was furiously pressing buttons on my end in the remote hope that I would be able to hear something. But in any event, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them up here right now. Otherwise, thank you for attending. And again, we'll have the May 9th webinar, which was originally supposed to be on disparate impact discrimination. Very exciting topic. But has now morphed into a situation where we're going to talk about the FLSA. We're going to talk about the FTC non-compete, and we're going to cover a little bit of disparate impact treatment if we can get to it in that seminar, or webinar. So please feel free to sign up for next week. And I don't see any other questions coming in. So thanks so much for your time. Oh, wait, maybe there's one here. Let me take a look here. So somebody's asking about public school. This is private employers. I would have to double check to make sure it doesn't apply to a local government employer. And I can do that and get back to you if you want to send an email to the email that was on the prior slide there. So you might fall under the federal contractor because you do get funds. But again, I'd have to double check that. Okay, good question. Sorry, I don't have an immediate answer for that. And again, thanks everyone for attending. Take care.
Thank you.